Content warning: this story includes scenes implying a serious car accident, a medical emergency, and memory loss. She walked into the civil affairs office like someone arriving at a verdict already written, but she wore red. It was not the brazen red of theatre, it was the kind of red that could not be ignored, the deep, quietly certain shade of a dress pressed the night before and folded with thought. The color made the glossy institutional light seem dimmer, turned the gray vinyl chairs into something softer for her to pass over. Heads tilted in the waiting room, not because she sought notice, but because she had made herself visible on a day built for erasing one another. Julian Hart looked up from the stack of documents like a man raising his eyes from a ledger. He registered the color as a minor miscalculation, an anomaly easily filed away. A dress doesn't alter the terms. He had rehearsed this morning's motions twice in the limousine. He knew the exact order of signatures, where his pen should rest for the photograph his assistants would take for the quarterly paper, how to keep his face blank enough that the cameras would print control his character. He had built a career on the assumption that things could be negotiated, categorized, and closed. Maya Lin stood for a moment by the door, a single red note in a room of beige paperwork. Her hand tightened around a leather clutch. When Julian's assistant murmured introductions and the clerk called their names, the noise of the office seemed to fade, all focus narrowing until the filing cabinets and the fluorescent hum pressed against the two of them as if the room itself pulled the story taut. They had been married once, on a rooftop balcony with lanterns and hands sealed over a cake neither of them tasted entirely. That memory slipped into the present at a glance. Julian with the dark suit that made him look like he belonged to a world where people could be ordered like menus. Maya in a dress that had been silk and laughter, leaning against the wind in a way that suggested laziness and courage together. Once, she had trusted him enough to ask him for a home. He had taken it as an asset and improved the mortgage terms. Everything in order, the clerk said, but the phrase was procedural and brittle. Paper rustled, pens clicked in a rhythm that to Julian sounded like closing a deal. To Maya it sounded like the closing of a throat. She signed slowly, her signature curved like something she had not used in a long time. It belonged to a girl before suits and balance sheets, to hands that had once learned to hold a chopstick delicately. Julian signed where his name belonged, a stroke that had always felt natural as breathing. There was a tremor in Maya's voice when she spoke afterward, thin as the paper between them. "You promised we'd talk," she said. There was no plea in it, only a ledger of what had been promised and what had been cancelled. Julian closed the folder. He watched the way the red dress shifted when she stood, how sunlight, when she stepped into the small square of it by the window, made that red glow slightly warmer. He had permission in the way a man has permission to look over the quarterly numbers, impersonal and precise. "I did what I had to," he said. His voice was even. "We both made choices." Her laugh was dry. "Choice," she echoed, as if tasting it and finding it flavorless. She moved toward the exit with a small, reluctant dignity. Outside, the day was all city. Buses, a woman with an umbrella, a child on a skateboard. It should have been the simple closing of a chapter. Instead, it felt like the first page of a new book she'd been forced to open. Julian stayed just a second longer, folding his hands, already picturing the email he would send his board. The phrasing, the calm that would convince anyone reading that his life remained untroubled. He didn't notice then the little red ribbon peeking from his briefcase, a remnant of a jacket she had once left behind. He didn't notice how his name felt hollow from inside the tall collar of his shirt. Outside the civil affairs office, Maya's phone flashed sunlight across a name she had not wanted to call. No one saw the hand that shook as she dialed. The call went to voicemail after one ring. She left a short message that was more like a soft exhale than a sentence, and then she walked, as if the city had never been hers to own. If this kind of slow-burning, true-to-life drama draws you in, subscribe. There are more stories like this to come. Julian took the elevator down, a descent mechanized and exact, and stepped into the foyer of Hart & Co., as if dunking into another persona. The marble, the chrome, the receptionist's greeting, all of it fitted him like armor. On the way to his corner office, he read the headlines on his phone. "Market steady, a philanthropic donation about to be announced by a different household, a rumor about a takeover that his media team wanted him to deny." He placed a call with gloved efficiency. By noon he was in his chair, the city laid out like a map beyond the glass, a late summer sky reflected like a promise he had made in another life. He did not, in any meaningful way, think about the red dress again until around 4, when Julian Hart, his sister, burst into the office with a face that had not yet been allowed to compose itself. "Have you been trying to reach her?" she asked, the words punched out as if into soft clay. "No," Julian lied, and the words scraped against him like paper across a glass table. He felt faintly ashamed because it was true and not true. He had glanced at his phone but had not called. He had imagined the day's formalities closing without further disturbance. Anything else was inefficiency at best, interference at worst. "She left the office," Evelyn said. "Cameras at the registry show her getting into a car by herself. Someone called to say there was an accident at the Bay Tunnel. They found a vehicle with heavy damage. She stopped, the rest choking on its way out. The dissonance of a corporate morning turning suddenly to a personal emergency is a condition the body does not understand how to process. Julian felt his mouth go dry, yet the decisions came with a practiced clarity. He ordered a driver. He asked Evelyn for information she could not give. He called the hospital listed and demanded to speak to anyone on duty. At the emergency entrance, the world seemed to tilt. A metal hospital sign glowed with indifferent blue. People moved with that precise forward motion that illness and stress impose upon strangers, each carrying grief in ways that make them look older than the minutes in their bank. Maya was not at the triage desk when Julian arrived. He found instead a policeman standing under a pale fluorescent light, the man's badge reflecting like a minor truth. "We found signs of a driver," the officer said, "but no driver. There's an injured woman brought in from a different nearby incident. She's in the trauma ward." Julian's chest tightened in a way that was not entirely panic and not entirely physical pain. The officer's words orbited but did not land. The car at the tunnel was registered to a rental agency. A witness, a delivery driver, remembered seeing a small black hatchback swerve and then a flash, the kind a person remembers only as if from a badly focused camera. They led him to a fluorescent corridor and a closed door. Behind it, the air smelled like antiseptic and plastic, and the antiseptic smell was, for a moment, the only thing that seemed real. Julian's mind supplied scenarios that were neat in the way spreadsheets can be: insurance claims, statements, signatures. Then he saw the woman in the bed. She was bandaged in places that made some parts of her vulnerable and other parts indomitable. A thin hematoma shadowed one eyelid. Her hair had come loose and lay wet against the pillow. She had a red ribbon tied loosely to the wrist, half hidden beneath the IV tape, the same color as the dress she had worn only hours before. Julian's breath lost its rhythm. "Is she?" he asked. The nurse, used to the language of medical possibility, shook her head in a way that was measured and kind. "She's stable for now, conscious. She's confused, short retrograde memory gaps. She doesn't seem to be able to place who she is right now." The phrase landed like a hand on the back of his neck. Confusion, memory. She is conscious. She is not whole. Julian expected anger first. Anger at the inefficiency, at the loss of control. But the feeling that arrived was smaller and more dangerous. A soft, slow unwinding of the certainty he had been built around. Outside the bed, Maya blinked and looked like someone waking from a different life. Her pupils were stripy with light, as if each blink tried to choose which story to keep. She searched the room as if the objects could be rearranged into a history that made sense. When her eyes met Julian's, there was a recognition that did not fit the name on her chart. "Do I know you?" she asked, and the question was stone smooth but brittle. Julian's throat closed around words that had been memorized for negotiation but were useless in prayer. "Maya," he said. Saying her name was an act of hope, as if names could be anchors. "Maya, it's Julian." She pursed her lips as if tasting a flavor she had once loved and no longer remembered. "Julian," she repeated, the sound a simple mirror. Then she looked away, at the wall, at a clock. I can't remember how I got here." For a moment, the hospital room existed in a vacuum where no one's past applied. The monitors beeped like distant judgments. Julian proved in that moment that nothing he had ever negotiated could secure the small, fragile continuity of someone's memory. They asked questions, the police, the doctors. Julian spoke with a steadiness that felt like a garment he had pulled on without checking that it fit. He told them where she had been earlier, the registry, her walk to the street, the voicemail she had left. He described the red dress. He signed forms he didn't read. All of it was an effort to create an order where something more fundamental had unraveled. Later, in a private corridor, a social worker leaned close and said quietly, "In cases like this, we do a standard psychiatric and neurologic evaluation. Retrograde amnesia can be transient, or it can be selective." She used the clinical terms like a map, but what Julian needed was not a map. He needed his life back the way a child needs a blanket. The night that followed was lit in a cruel chiaroscuro, flash from cameras as the story of the accident leaked into feeds, messages piling up like small knives, sent emails with no response, a blank space where the woman he had been moving through life with existed in his mind like a missing file. People Julian paid to solve problems advised him to control the narrative. He dismissed them all because none of their solutions could fill the empty cell of a person's memory. News outlets asked for statements. His assistant prepared a release. "Mr. Hart is cooperating fully with authorities." He posted it, the language cold as the corporate language of closure. He showed it to no one. It seemed ridiculous and truthful at once. Maya's first extraction from the hospital came with a series of tests. A CT scan revealed no catastrophic hemorrhage, which was, under the circumstances, a small mercy. The doctors spoke of concussions and time, of the ways the brain sometimes unstitched its stories in order to heal. Julian listened and annotated the words in the margins of his mind as if they might become actionable. She went home in a car driven by the sister of a friend, an arrangement made more from necessity than from affection. At the front door, Maya paused, running a hand along the banister as if learning the material of the house again. She looked at a photograph on the mantel. A wedding, older and softer than Julian remembered. She traced the faces, and when she reached the image of their daughter, a child with a thin braid and a laugh frozen in pixels, she had to ask, "Who is this?" Maya asked, pointing at the little girl with a braid. "Lena," Julian said, because the answer cost him nothing and everything. "She's our daughter." The word "our" was both anchor and a blade. Maya's eyes filled, and she crumpled slightly, a movement Julian noticed like a subtle recalculation of gravity. Tears for some come without reasons you can name. For others, they announce themselves as the body's way of cataloguing loss. The hospital prescribed rest and follow-up. The neurologist recommended patience. The social worker suggested counseling. Julian ordered a private specialist. He watched as the woman who had worn red at the registry slept that night with a small red scarf tucked into her pillowcase like a piece of the day she had not remembered. What followed were small emergencies and larger indecisions. Questions amassed like unpaid invoices and demanded answers no one could produce. Did the accident happen because she had slipped from the car? Because someone had cut her off? Because the weather had turned, or because something inside her had snapped? People liked explanations that resembled sentences. The facts were fragments. In the days that followed, the family's private lines hummed with rumors. A whispered allegation of a long-ago betrayal, a rumor that paternity might be in question, the suggestion that someone had manipulated dates and attention to gain advantage in the company. Julian, who had spent a life reducing decisions to metrics, felt metrics failing him. He found a photograph in a drawer, a red ribbon in sunlight, and the sight of it made his chest contract. Evelyn took to pacing the office, to daily calls with lawyers who spoke in hypotheticals that presumptively favored their client, the company, the shares, the guardianship of the child. "We have to consider all eventualities," the lawyer said. The phrase tasted of calculation. But what did calculation do when the ledger was a child's memory and a woman's sense of self? The paternity issue was a problem with a financial underside. If the child was legally not his, then his claim to future managerial continuity and shareholder legitimacy could be compromised. Advisors suggested tests, discrete DNA sampling, something that could be latent for the right moment when strategically necessary. Julian bristled at the idea, and then, with a coldness he did not like, found himself nodding. The patriarchal systems he ran taught him that lineage and legitimacy were not sentimentalities but legal instruments. He told no one he did it out of fear. He told no one he did it because the idea that his bloodline could be erased was an insult to every flaw of his life. But the confession is private. Instead, he arranged for the test. A sample from a child's toothbrush posed as a routine pediatric check. The doctor, courteous and sympathetic, obtained a small swab and assured them of privacy. Maya sat in a chair with her hands folded, her head tilted in a way that suggested she had already forgotten how to hold herself as a whole person. "It's intrusive," she muttered at one point, but even in the mutter there was a small, uncertain acquiescence. The scene felt as if it were part of a larger choreography where everyone had roles and the music was something none of them had chosen. Meanwhile, the press smelled a story. There were headlines about the accident, speculation about the causes, and the occasional vicious whisper about affairs and betrayals. Julian had the resources to drown the rumor mill, but pulling out all the stops would only underline the idea of trouble. So he pulled a few strings quietly. Statements were calibrated to the public's appetite for stability and nothing more. Public stability, he had learned long ago, often required private sacrifice. Maya's memory returned in fits and starts, like a song whose chorus she knew only when someone else sang it loudly enough. One afternoon she sat by their kitchen window, hands folded in her lap, as sunlight painted a red square across the floor, the ribbon of color a small sharp thing that kept reappearing. She opened a drawer and found a pair of worn ballet flats, the soles softened by years. She laughed once, a small surprise, and no one in the house made the mistake of calling it back into being. "It's like the world is differently organized," she said to Julian, "like the rooms have been rearranged and I have to find where things live." Julian watched her. In the quiet of their kitchen, with a kettle hissing and the city away, and the child playing with blocks in another room, he rehearsed apologies that never reached her ears. He wanted to name the things he had failed at. The small, ungenerous acts dressed as pragmatism, the divorce papers he had prepared, and then signed like a man trimming loose branches. He wanted to point to the ways he had been absent and blame the rhythms of work. But when the words came to his lips, they sounded like corporate doublespeak, hollow with policy and projection. He folded them back into himself. A photograph, taken in the years before, surfaced during a night when insomnia stitched the house together with small sounds. In the photograph, Maya wore red, standing under a string of wedding lanterns, smiling as if she had found a place. Julian laid a hand on the frame as if he could smooth lost time down like a wrinkle. He did not know if the photograph made him more honest or just more aware of how many small cruelties lay in the space between them. The unreturned phone calls, the financial priorities, a charity gala he skipped and claimed he regretted. Memory was returning in parts to her. Remorse was arriving to him in full, like rain. Then came the call at midnight. A police officer on the line, the tone clipped with a procedural finality that no one rehearsed for. "We have something you should see," the officer said. It was not where they had expected it to be. They had located the hatchback, the car with the heavy damage. The rental agency had traced the driver's contract. There were CCTV images from the tunnel, a burst of lights, then a blur, then a shape on the side of the road. In the footage, a figure walked away from the car and stacked her jacket over the shoulder and then walked into the night. Julian stared at the screen as if the pixels might be rearranged to show what he wanted. The woman stepping away purposefully, not as someone lost, but as someone making a choice. Instead, the footage only recorded motion and distance and the way the light caught a red sleeve for one flicking second before everything blurred. "Could she have left on foot?" the detective asked. "It's possible," Julian said. He felt the stretcher of his life shifting. The image of her walking away haunted him like a moral question he could not answer. They traced a path of calls and messages, and there emerged, like a small, unwelcome truth, the name of a man who had been on the margins of Maya's life. Not a lover in the glossy sense tabloids dream up, but a friend who had shown up in texts with the kind of familiarity that makes people choose to stay during certain storms. The messages were not explicit, but they suggested the existence of other histories where he was not present. Julian's mind began drafting a different calculus, the possible motives of someone who might want to unsettle a marriage, or the reasons a woman might leave a car and walk toward water and then toward nothing. Parenthood, he thought, flicked on like a notification. Was the child safe? Who had been with her? The list of people who might have the answers included the loyal, the secretive, and those who held grudges thin as sugar glass. Maya's memory, in the days after, offered only small fragments of names and places that did not connect into a whole. She remembered a balcony and the feel of cool air on a wedding night. She remembered the sound of a child's voice and the smell of soup on a sick day. She could not sequence events properly past a certain point. Each time she tried, it was like stretching a photograph until the edges blurred. The paternity question pulled at Julian like an undertow. He watched the child, Lena, who had a laugh that started at the belly, who trusted the world without reservation. He loved her with a kind of fierce scattershot devotion that revealed itself in the small acts he would commit and then justify. Taking Lena to piano lessons he himself had missed as a child, sitting through school plays and sacrificing client dinners with a calm he had not expected to enjoy. He realized, with a constricting clarity, that his identity as father had not been transactional. It had shaped his nights, his small mercies. To imagine those hours invalidated, to imagine someone else's DNA quietly undermining that, felt like a theft that would cost him more than money could inventory. Yet there was another part of him, trained by markets and boards, that considered leverage, legitimacy, legal guardianship, the impression to the shareholders that the line of succession remained intact. His fear was not simply about losing a child. It was about losing the scaffold he had built his life around, a scaffold that included more than affection. It included continuity, image, the way the city courts and courts of public opinion would interpret his household's stability. Evelyn, who loved him in her own fierce, protective way, argued the practical route. "We have to secure everything," she whispered across a phone in a tone that brooked no sentiment. "We get tests, we prepare contingencies. If you let the press sniff this for too long, you'll be strangled by speculation." Julian agreed, because in uncertainty, the only usable asset was action. He ordered discrete sequences, a private investigator to verify the rental timeline, a legal firm to review guardianship paperwork, a pediatrician who would secure a sample for the test with the least possible fuss. It felt sleazy and loving at once. He called it protection when he spoke to himself. Maya, meanwhile, navigated her days in a kind of fog. She grew skilled at performing small domestic tasks and letting context be a teacher. Sometimes the right thing, a scent, a joke, a familiar chair, would unburden a memory, and she'd forget it had been missing. Other things simply refused to be summoned. She asked for help in ways that seemed polite and embarrassed. "What's the second floor for?" she would ask at night, as if trying the house on like a garment. On a morning when rain threaded the city skies, Julian found a letter in the glove compartment of her car, a note folded so many times that its creases were intimate like a palm line. He opened it with the deliberation of a man who reads for meaning rather than news. Inside, a paragraph scratched in even, careful hand. A confession? A question? It said simply that she had been thinking of leaving for some time, that there were things she had not been able to say when they were married to other priorities. It split the day into two halves, before the letter and after the letter. He kept the letter private, though it burned like a small coal under his sternum. He did not send it to lawyers. He did not use it as an instrument in the boardroom. Instead, he folded it and placed it beneath the photograph where the red ribbon was tied and let it sit like a quiet accusation. The crescendo of that first month after the accident arrived not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, but with a subtle procedural pivot, a formal request for a paternity test. The wording was official and spare, the sort of language calibrated to imply necessity rather than malice. Someone suggested doing it in private. Someone else argued that secrecy breeds distrust. There were no easy answers. Each decision seemed like a calculation that would either shore up the future or burn a bridge to a past he might one day wish he had salvaged. Maya watched all of this with the distance of someone learning to love a place again. Sometimes she would sit and watch Lena play, the child building towers with wooden blocks, and she would laugh as if the sound came from somewhere else. Once she paused mid-laugh and asked quietly, "Does she always build them that way?" Julian, always the man who read the architecture of people-like buildings to be modeled and maintained, heard the question like a warning. He realized then that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, would not only remap his responsibilities, but would redraw the lines of affection with which he had been tender and careless in equal measure. And in the background, the red motif lingered like a shadow that had taken up residence, the dress folded in a drawer, the scarf knotted below an IV wrap, a red ribbon clipped to a child's backpack. The color threaded through the days like an insistence. It was neither accusation nor apology. It was simply a mark that demanded being named. One evening, after a day of test appointments and tenuous small talk, Maya opened a box of old keepsakes that had been moved from an apartment they once shared. Papers rustled. A smell of perfume rose like a memory. She pulled out an envelope sealed with a red wax sticker, the kind used for invitations. Inside was a photograph Julian had never seen in months. 2 young people on a ferry, wind-whipping hair, lanterns reflected in the water. The back of the photograph had a message in handwriting that sloped, gentle and rapid. She showed it to Julian, and the smile that touched his face was small but real. For a minute, the present was not an interrogation, but a place where 2 people could look at a photograph and find themselves there again. But the peace did not last. There are days when even the best intentions cannot keep the mechanics of a larger fight from grinding forward. A note arrived in Julian's inbox that another shareholder had inquired about potential leadership continuity. The board wanted reassurances. People who had once toasted their philanthropy now asked publicly for evidence that the company's lineage was intact. Julian thought of the photograph and the red dress and the child who kicked her feet when she laughed. He thought of the choices he had made and the ones he had let someone else make for him. He thought of his sister pacing and the lawyer speaking of contingencies. He thought of the letter folded beneath the photograph and how small it seemed compared to the architecture of the man he had built himself to be. None of the architect's plans made room for forgetting, but the mind, as rudimentary as a house with missing beams, had become the site of a sudden structural failure. On a rainy Friday, the private lab called "Preliminary Processing Complete." They could proceed to full analysis when authorized. An automated voice told him the next steps. Julian stared at his phone like a man looking at a lit fuse and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he might be too late for the thing he had always insisted he could protect. He went home that night and found Maya sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling on the tile. She had the red scarf around her shoulders, not from fashion but from habit. When she looked up, she smiled in a way that was both new and unbearably old. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if we remember ourselves accurately, or do we just remember the stories we tell?" The question hung like a translucent curtain between them, and Julian knew the ledger could not balance it. He wanted answers, and he wanted apologies to be true remedies. He wanted to believe that contracts had weight against everything. He wanted to imagine that by signing and annulling paper, he could return tenderness. Instead, the city rain tapped out a slow, patient rhythm against the window. The red scarf across her shoulders seemed suddenly fragile, like a small flag that recorded a day's worth of weather. He reached across the table and took her hand. It felt warm and uncertain. Outside, in the dark, the bay tunnel lights blinked like the low pulse of something that had been left running. The police still asked questions. The private investigator still left messages. The lab still hummed with samples waiting to be processed. A woman who once wore red and a man who had worn success like armor were caught in a slow machinery of consequence neither of them had made, and neither knew yet if the things they would choose next would buy back what had been lost. A week later, as the test results were being scheduled and lawyers rehearsed scenarios that smelled faintly of loss, Maya stood in front of a mirror in a small hallway and did something she had not done in a long time. She put on the red dress again. It was a conscious act, a checking of fit, a measuring of memory. The fabric moved over her as if greeting an old friend. When she stepped out into the living room, small and carrying the weight of someone learning to be a person again, Julian rose and he looked at her, as one looks at a painting one has only recently learned to read. She did not know still all the threads that had been pulled tight behind her. She did not know of the conversations held in rooms with closed doors and clipped voices. She did not know of the list of contingencies that had been drafted at the insistence of a sister who loved him by protecting the empire. She did not know that her arrival in red had already lodged itself in Julian's head as a kind of punctuation. A full stop that smelled like defiance and grief. As they sat down for dinner, the child at the table played with a red ribbon, looping it over and over into a small knot. The knot gleamed, catching the lamplight, a simple emblem of how a single color had come to carry so much meaning. Julian watched his daughter and felt the first real tendril of regret curl into him, not the kind practiced in speeches that admit fault as PR, but the kind that lives in the chest and makes the breath come uneven. He imagined the possibilities of the next months, courtrooms or conciliations, statements to cameras or moments in hospital waiting rooms. He imagined the way reputation could be managed and the way hearts once broken are not always willing to be mended. He had miscalculated, it seemed, not in business, but in love. He had thought the systems he controlled would suffice to protect the life he had built. He had not anticipated that one small human mind, fragile, fallible, capable of forgetting, could unravel an entire architecture of meaning. That night, as the house fell quiet and the city exhaled beneath them, Julian sat alone in his study and unfolded the letter he had kept. He read it again and again, each pass making the words heavier. He looked at the photograph with Luna's braid and saw the way light had gathered in her face. He could not yet say what would become of them, only that the ledger had been reopened and that some entries could no longer be reconciled by ink. On his desk, beside the photograph, lay the red ribbon from the child's hair. He picked it up and held it between thumb and forefinger. The color had become not only a sign of defiance, but a marker of the small things that made human life real. The way a laugh defied explanation, the way a hand could be trusted, the way a person could be present one minute and absent the next. Outside, the rain eased, and a faint moon flared through the clouds. The house hummed with the ordinary sounds of a life still in progress, the dishwasher cycling, a clock marking seconds into minutes, a child breathing in a room that had not yet learned to be guarded. Julian folded the ribbon and placed it back in the photograph frame, where it would remain visible and impossible to misread, a small, stubborn emblem of that day she had chosen to make herself seen. It lived there on his desk like an accusation and a prayer. The lab called 2 days later. Julian took the call in the private retreat of his office, a room meant for decisions that required the softening of glass and the hardening of will. The voice on the line was courteous and precise, offering preliminary language meant to steady emotion, samples processed, chain intact, results to be delivered to the requesting counsel. He felt the familiar surge, anticipation braided tightly with dread, and when the word came, simple and clinical, it landed with an odd neutral thud. The child was his. The news should have been balm. Instead, it loosened something sharper. For all the numbers and certainties that had been restored, nothing in the lab report could stitch back the trust that had been torn by the secret of how the sample had been taken. Maya had not yet been told. Julian had authorized discreet means without asking. He had justified the act as protection, as stewardship. In his head, the calculus had been clean, one line protecting innumerable future possibilities. In the small human ledger of his household, secrecy was a subtraction far more devastating than any external rumor. He thought, for a moment, that relief would arrive like light through Venetian blinds. There was no light. There was only the slow accretion of small facts, a private investigator's invoice sitting on his desk, the letter folded under the photograph, the red ribbon pressed like a fossil in a frame. Those things kept their own pressure on him, like a rule of physics he had neglected. When he told Evelyn, she bristled, but then softened with the practical air of someone who did not confuse legality with feeling. "It's yours," she said aloud, as if that settled something sacred into place. "That's what matters to the board and to the succession papers." Julian watched her, and for a moment he felt like two people at once. The boardroom man who measured bloodlines as assets, and the father who had let fear define how he loved. He had won on paper. He had surrendered where it mattered. The months shaped themselves into a routine of medical appointments, therapy sessions, and staged appearances that reassured the markets but not the heart. Maya's memory returned unevenly. She reclaimed hours and characters with an effort that looked, from the outside, like bravery. She reclaimed laughter like a reclaimed city, room by room. She reclaimed not everything by any means. Plenty of places in her interior remained locked, doorways she reached only to find the knob turning to dust. She resisted Julian's attempts to control how the process unfolded. The knowledge that he had arranged for a DNA test without asking, that he had treated their daughter like an instrument in a ledger, lodged in her like a splinter. It made certain tender things brittle. It made vows feel less like the language of two people and more like clauses in a corporate contract. "Why would you do that?" she asked him one evening, eyes rimmed with fatigue and a bewilderment that was nearly for him unbearable. He stopped, the rehearsed defenses evaporating. "I was protecting what I thought we had." "That's not protection," she said. "That's possession." Her words were a small explosion. Julian wanted to tidy them into justification, but there was no neat clause to fan away the sting. He had been trying to protect an image, the comfortable procession that his name promised, and in doing so, he had underestimated the way people will not consent to be managed, even by love. The company's calendar, merciless and indifferent, pushed forward. A shareholder dinner, a charity event, a speech at a think tank, each duty a public test of control. Evelyn moved deftly, as if she had always known how to navigate the currents that follow scandal. She smiled with the accuracy of a person who could measure benefit with a glance. She did not, however, measure the cost to Julian's interior life. She assumed he would prefer the victory to the wound. The private investigator found little to change the public narrative. No evidence of foul play at the tunnel, no clandestine meetings with a lover, no conspiracy to unseat him. There were texts with a man, Huo-je, who appeared in Maya's life as someone offering comfort and a listening ear during nights when Julian's attention was otherwise contracted. The messages were not incriminating. They were, at most, human, concern, misgivings, the kind of conversation that happens when two people share time that would have been a marriage's byproduct. The press, when they had anything to chew, chewed predictably. When they had nothing, their teeth clicked in the sound of people bored and waiting. Then came the invitation. A wedding that would, by all logic, change everything. It was the wedding of a close friend, an event Evelyn suggested as an opportunity to be seen together, to present a family unified and robust. "Attendance is optics," Evelyn said, a short, efficient sentence that meant more than it let on. "It shows continuity." The invitation laid itself out on the mahogany table like a small ultimatum. Maya hesitated when she read it. For a moment she considered declining, and then she chose the red dress again. Not the dress she had worn on divorce day, but a different gown, simpler, the color the same deep, ember red, intention worn like armor, or like a shield. She told Julian she wanted to go to see how people now oriented to them. She said she wanted Lena to see faces from her school. She said she wanted to understand who she was in the map of their lives. The day of the wedding arrived with a brittle brightness. The hall had been decorated in golds and ivories, but red found its way into the scene like a stubborn memory. Flowers, a ribbon at the end of an aisle, the flush of laughter. Julian dressed carefully, each fold of cloth a reminder that he could still manipulate appearance if not consequence. He arrived early and sat, as if on a bench outside his own heart, watching people file in and place themselves as characters in an established play. Maya came in with Lena on her hand. The child wore a neat braid and a dress that caught the light. She looked like a small queen walking an aisle that belonged to none of the adults. People turned to her as children are turned toward, because children are honest servants of the scene, and because the presence of a child makes even awkward gatherings softer. Julian felt a small, fierce pride watch her. It hurt in a way that had nothing to do with board meetings. Huja arrived not long after, and for reasons that had nothing to do with theatrics, he sat in the back, as if by choice he wanted to be an observer rather than a player. There was a stillness in him that made Julian notice, the kind of attention that bared no agenda. He watched Maya with something like a careful private devotion. It made Julian clench his jaw. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were exchanged in the warm, unself-conscious way that belongs to people not burdened by inheritance or public perception. There was a moment when the groom lifted the bride's hands and spoke of home, and Julian's chest tightened because it was a thing he recognized and had once given with ease. Hearing it from another man obliterated a small arrogance in him, that love belonged to whatever he declared it to be. Then there was a scene he did not expect. Late in the reception, when the dancing had settled toward small groups and whispered conversations, Maya stood to object, or perhaps not to object to anything. She stood because she could not hold the feeling in her body any longer. Conversations dimmed, the lights softened like an eye closing. She took Lena's hand and brought her to the center of the room. She wore the red dress like a flag. "I want everyone to hear something," she said. Her voice carried without being theatrical. It was clear, honest, and somehow calm enough to be dangerous. People leaned in, not because they expected scandal, but because the human drama is a hunger that politely ignores its own cruelty. "I want to tell a story about a little girl who has an excellent laugh," Maya began. "She builds towers and then knocks them down and claps like a queen when she succeeds. She asks a lot of questions and refuses to be hurried. She is my child." The words landed in the room like stones tossed into a pond. Julian felt himself buoyed and then flung by the impact. He had known the fact, had the certificate in a file no one saw, but in that public declaration, her voice naming parenthood without a legal preface, something more absolute had shifted. It was not that he needed public correction, he needed the humility of having his love affirmed, not proven. "I also want to say," she continued, eyes scanning faces, "that there are things that happened to me that I didn't choose. There are days I woke and did not know who I was. There were times when decisions were made about me and about my child as if we were inventory. I have learned that being owned by fear, by strategy, by someone else's good intentions, feels like being erased." She did not mention Julian by name. She did not need to. A hush settled. Julian felt the entire weight of what she refused and what she reclaimed. "You can love someone and also be wrong for trying to protect them by cutting away their choices," she said. "I am saying this because I want Lena to grow up in a world where she is not managed, where she is not a stake to be defended at the cost of the people who love her. If I have to teach her one thing, it is to keep her agency." At that moment, more than legalities collapsed. Julian's belief that he could prioritize outcomes over people, that secrecy equaled safety, that his role as protector could substitute for partnership. The realization arrived in a painful, honest flare. In protecting the future, he had overwritten the present. Evelyn's face tightened. Guests exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Huoji, from the back, did not stand and did not clap. He only watched with a steady expression that told Julian he had not known what to expect, and yet had seen more clearly than Julian had the contours of what Maya needed. Julian moved toward them with a speed that surprised even him. "Maya," he started. She turned, and for a moment their eyes met. In that surge, he saw not the woman who had been a part of his life in ledgered entries, but a person who had rebuilt herself in quiet rooms, who had refused to be a problem to be solved by governance, and who had learned how to say her truth in public without asking permission. In that look, there was no malice. There was simply a refusal to return to a script she had never authored. "I know you think you did it for the best," she said softly when he reached them. "But it wasn't your place to decide." Her words did not slam a door. They slid it closed gently but irrevocably. She hugged Lena and stepped back, the small physical act of a parent placing a child between public and private. What followed was not theater, but consequence. Julian felt the old instincts, the lawyerly, the managerial, rise and then stumble. He could organize investigations, issue press releases, call confidential meetings, and even produce legally binding documents that proved paternity. None of it would counter the moral ledger that a woman in red had placed on a table in front of a room full of strangers and asked to be balanced. After the wedding, in the private quiet of their car on the drive home, Lena dozed and the city lights smeared like paint on water. Julian drove, but the steadiness of his hands betrayed him. Evelyn placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, but said nothing. The house that awaited them felt different in some soft way, its rooms rearranged by a choice that had been made in full view. The weeks after the wedding were a calculus of small things and stubborn transformations. Maya moved toward independence in the everyday ways of people who had decided to keep themselves. A separate accountant for her personal funds, an apartment she rented not far from the house but close enough for Lena to spend weekdays with her mother. She did not leave the marriage with anger so much as with the quiet firmness of someone reclaiming autonomy. Julian, confronted with choices he had once made for the sake of imagined stability, found himself cut out of small decisions that had, until recently, been his by default. The board demanded reassurance and Julian offered statements and legal documents. He kept the paternity result in a drawer, and yet did not use it as an instrument to force reconciliation. He discovered, perhaps too late, that his greatest mistakes were not the financial ones easily rectified. They were the daily omissions, missed recitals, unsent notes, 1,000 small absences that accumulate like dust. Lena, in time, navigated the new shape of family with a child's resilience. She answered questions with the directness children possess, and when she asked hard things, "Will we still have dinner together?" Julian learned to answer with the modesty of a man who had discovered that promises take work to keep. He took her to piano lessons and to the park, and in those ordinary acts he tried to reforge the small trust that repairs in increments. Evelyn, who had once seemed to profit from crisis, softened in ways that were not entirely theatrical. She appeared at school plays and bought Lena flowers for no reason at all. She and Julian had conversations now that no longer had the antiseptic edges of boardroom language. They too were learning the hard arithmetic of forgiveness and humility. Maya found herself in moments of unexpected grace. She reconnected with friends who had been pushed to the margins of day-to-day life. She started volunteering at a children's reading program where she discovered that teaching others to build towers and knock them down again was a kind of therapy, not only for the child, but for the adult. There was no tidy reconciliation, no sweep of cinematic absolution. Julian tried, meaningfully, imperfectly, to apologize. He sat with the awkwardness of words that wanted to be gestures and learned, slowly, how to make apology more than performance. Maya, for her part, accepted some amends and refused others. The terms of their coexistence shifted into something more complex than a marriage or a divorce, a negotiated life where the past held weight and the future was uncertain. The final public reckoning came not as a courtroom verdict, but as an intimate, quiet sealing. On a mild autumn afternoon, Julian attended a small ceremony where Maya stood to sign documents. Not a relinquishing of rights, but a redefinition of custody and care guided by the child's best interest rather than legal advantage. In that room, bright with the ordinary light of late day, Julian watched her sign, her hand steady, the red silk of her scarf catching the sun. It was a scene he could have prearranged in his mind as a victory or a defeat, but it settled into him as both. He had lost a kind of control he had never fully appreciated owning. He had not lost the laugh of his daughter, nor the small chances at morning pancakes, nor the ability to be present. He walked out of the registry with a folder of papers that proved what he still had and what had changed. He felt empty in a way that belonged to a man who had learned late the cost of his calculations. He thought of the photograph with the red ribbon and the letter folded beneath it. He thought of the small human habits that had been neglected in favor of grand strategy. Weeks became months. Julian fashioned a new kind of presence, slower, less certain, and quieter. He attended Lena's recitals, sat at the edge of evening dinners when the family managed to gather, and answered the child's offhand philosophical questions with the honesty of someone learning to be less performative. He did not, however, regain everything. The intimacy he had once taken for granted with Maya remained, for now, a different currency. The red dress never returned to the public stage. Maya kept it folded in the back of her closet, and sometimes, when she opened the door, Julian could see it as a flash of color. It lived there like a relic, a reminder that appearing in the world with an intention could change the shape of a life. On a winter morning, months after the wedding, Julian found an envelope by his front door. Inside was a photograph, different from the others. It was taken on a cloudy day, a candid moment of Lena asleep in Maya's lap while they read a book. Maya had scribbled a line on the back in a hand shaped now by clearer memories. For Lena, keep her laughter safe. There was no apology line, no plea for reconciliation. It was a simple instruction, a trust laid in ink. Julian felt then the ache of being proud and humbled at the same time. He had not lost everything. There were appearances, property, legal standings, a daughter who loved him, but he had lost the ease with which he had once moved through someone else's interior life. He had discovered the price of protecting at the expense of asking, of making decisions in the name of security while forgetting to secure love itself. A year after the day she walked into the registry wearing red, Julian sat alone in his study and pulled the red ribbon from the photograph frame. He turned it in his fingers, noting the fray at one edge, the way light caught on the fabric. The ribbon had the quiet authority of things that survive storms, small, stubborn, and honest. He folded it gently and placed it into a new envelope. He wrote nothing on the outside. He walked to the little house that Maya had kept, where Lena still slept sometimes and where the air smelled of lemon cleaner and old stories. He knocked softly. Maya opened the door, surprised by the way a simple act could still catch a person off guard. He handed her the envelope with hands that trembled in a way they had not during contract signings or shareholder meetings. "For Lena," he said, not quite sure if it was asking permission or making a request. Maya took the ribbon, looked at it, and then looked at him. There were no grand gestures, only the exchange of two people who had been reshaped by consequence. She placed the ribbon into a small box, and then after a moment, she folded the box closed. It felt like a private ritual, a closing of a chapter that needed neither applause nor witnesses. "You lost a lot," she said simply. He made a sound that was half agreement, half confession. "I did," he said, "and I'm trying to learn." She watched him for a long time, and in that look he read no promise of return, but the possibility of something else. Partnership reimagined at the edges, not as a recovery of old comforts, but as the beginning of a more honest, more modest work. He walked away with nothing to mark his victory except the knowledge that the things he had once deemed indispensable, absolute control, the clean arithmetic of decisions, were insufficient when laid against real people. The sheen of his public success remained, and he would keep it. There were obligations and responsibilities he could not ignore. But the center of his life, the place where counting mattered more than balance sheets, had changed. He would spend the coming years attending to small acts, truly attending, and letting the measure of his wealth be set by how present he could be. Outside, the city was a quiet geometry of snow and light. Julian paused and looked at the photograph in his phone, the one where Maya had once stood under lanterns, red against wind. And he felt, with an ache that did not require dramatics, that he had learned how costly silence can be. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic confession that washed everything clean. There was instead the slow accrual of ordinary work, hours at recitals, dinners shared without the gilded framing of obligation, honest conversations about boundaries and mistakes. He had gained in a way the honesty of knowing what he had lost and the humility of trying to repair it. At night, when the house was empty and the red ribbon lay in its small box, he sometimes imagined what might have been if he had noticed earlier, if he had listened more, if he had reached for apologies before strategies. The fantasies were small and useless. What remained was the truer, harder thing, living with the consequences and building, imperfectly, a life that made space for the people he loved. If this story of regret, memory, and small real recoveries moved you, subscribe for more character-driven dramas.